I'm going to be presenting today the 1933 Hston Mt Everest expedition. And those who don't know me, my name is Eddie Hackstaff. I'm a philatelist, also known as a stamp collector, a pilot, and a mountaineer. So getting to merge these topics into one presentation is kind of fun for me. One of the last great aviation obstacles during the 20th century was to fly over Mt Everest. Man had already flown around the world, crossed the great oceans nonstop, and had flown over both the North and South Poles at this time. But no one had flown over the highest point on Earth. So this is going to be the story of that first flight over Mt Everest. Start with a little background on Mt Everest. For those that aren't familiar with it, Mt Everest is the highest mountain in the world. It sits at 8,849 meters, also known as 29,032 feet, as of 2015. Now the measurements change now and then. Nepal wanted to measure from the rock. China wanted to measure from the top of the snow. Everybody argues back and forth. We're going with 29,032 feet here. Over the years, it's also had many names. The original European name was given to it by Andrew Waugh, which is the British surveyor of India at the time. He called it Peak 15 because it was just a point on the horizon they're looking at from India. And so they just numbered the peaks until they could go back later and survey and make all the calculations. It was renamed to Mt Everest by Waugh to honor the British surveyor Sir George Everest. Everest was the surveyor in charge of the Great Trigonometric Survey of India, one of the greatest surveying efforts ever in the world. He was honored with that. Believe it or not, it also had some local names. I mean, we didn't need to rename it. From the Nepal side, it's called Sagarmatha. On the Tibetan/China side, it's called Chomolungma or Chomolungma, a couple different spellings there. It's located in the Himalayan mountain range on the Nepal-China border. The China border, it's the Tibetan Autonomous Region now. Back at the time of 1933, it was Tibet. So it's on the border there. So in 1952, when they were surveying it, Radhanath Sikdar, I may be butchering these pronunciations, he was an Indian mathematician and surveyor. He was also called a computer. Back then, they called mathematicians that did all the crunching of the numbers computers. So he was a surveyor, and he made the first calculations to identify Everest as the world's highest point. At that time, it was measured at 8,840 meters. I got to be honest, I took a civil engineering course in college where we had to do some surveying around the college campus. 300 feet at a time. I swear I was further off than 100 feet when I got back to the start point. Maybe not that far, but when you look at the fact that these guys are surveying from India to the summit of Mount Everest in the Nepal-China border, they measured 8,840 meters. That is not far off. That is mind-blowing to think that they could measure it that accurate from that far away. These people are amazing. As for mountaineering, 1921 was the first expedition to the peak, and that was by the British expedition coming in from the Tibetan side. It wasn't climbed until 1953 during another British expedition where Edmund Hillary and New Zealander Tenzing Norgay, he's been claimed by 3 different countries as Nepali, Tibetan, and India, so everybody wants to claim him. So he's got 3 different nationalities. So, little side note, the first Brit to actually climb and summit the peak was in 1973. 20 years later. Brits were doing all these expeditions, getting close to the summit, but technically a Brit didn't summit until 1973. The idea, it was originally suggested in 1918 by Dr. Alexander Kellis, and at that time it was just an idea. In 1921, American aviator Roland Rolfs, he declared his intention to fly over Mount Everest. Now, he was at that time the holder of the world altitude record of 34,610 feet, so he did that in a Curtiss triplane. Technically, you could fly over it if you could get that elevation. There were a lot more things involved, and he never took it any further than he was declared he was going to do it. Never went anywhere. In 1925, English aviator Alan Cobham, as he was flying through the area, actually flew within 40 miles. In 1932, the American adventurer Richard Halliburton and his pilot Moy Stevens flew within about 15 miles from the summit. A few months back, I did the 1932 flying carpet flight. And this is very important, this flight that they did. They may not have thought it was that important, more than fun, but it was very important for this expedition. So that's Roland Rolfs. Here's a picture of Alan Cobham. And here's the picture of Halliburton and Stevens with the flying carpet that we had talked about in the previous presentation. The British plan. In 1932, Colonel Etherton, he was pretty experienced in the Himalayan regions, and Colonel Blacker, who was an experienced pilot, present the plan to the Royal Geographical Society in England. All these expeditions had to be presented to the Royal Geographic Society to get their blessing to be able to go and do these expeditions in the name of the British Empire. It was determined that this was going to be a scientific expedition. This was not just to check a box. It's going to be a scientific expedition to research technologies required to do it, capabilities of high-altitude flying. Can you control planes? These were biplanes still at this time, okay? Open cockpit biplanes. And a big part of this was mapping the region around Mount Everest. There were no good maps of the area, and they wanted to test a bunch of mapping equipment. So they were joined by squadron leader Douglas Hamilton, Marquis of Douglas and Clydesdale. He was MP at the time. He was the son of the 13th Duke of Hamilton. He was brought on as chief pilot. Air Commodore Peregrine Fellows was brought on to lead the expedition and head its planning. So what was still required? You got your main leaders. You're all set to go, except you still have all the technological solutions you have to overcome. Diplomatic agreements. A lot of diplomatic agreements had to go into place. And there was a lot of financial support. So technological solutions. The aircraft, they picked the PV-6, which was a prototype to the Westland Wallace bomber, and the Westland PV-3, a torpedo bomber that they modified for the flight. And the stamp on the right there from Sierra Leone shows the image of the two aircraft that were used. The one on the top is the PV-6 and the one on the bottom is the PV-3. Engines and fuel. They had to get modified engines for these things because not only did they have to reach these altitudes, they had to be able to still control the airplane. So it couldn't be just its max elevation that it was going to go to. They had to get up there and still fly the airplane around. So they got two new engines from Bristol Pegasus IS-3 engines. Shell Oil was going to provide the fuel. Special fuel was needed to get at that altitude so it wouldn't freeze and wouldn't have problems. Shell also provided all the fuel for the route and all the other subsequent flying they were going to do. They're still going to fly some other aircraft all the way from England to India. And we'll talk about that after a bit. Heating. The suits had to be heated because not only did your pilots have to stay somewhat warm, they had to stay warm enough to do their work. Oxygen, got to get oxygen to them flying at that altitude. The cameras, what kind of cameras could function at that altitude and create 3D mapping and all this stuff. These were very specialized cameras. Then the film that was going to go in them. You're dealing with a lot of low temperatures. Simple film can crack and break, things like that. So a lot went on. And actually, Invention Magazine in May actually published an article, and this is the article here, about all the technologies going into it. These were inventions almost. A lot of cutting-edge technology, or using what's available but having to modify it for what they were going to do. So a lot had to go into it. Diplomatic agreements. In England, Douglas Hamilton, he was a sitting member of Parliament and had to be released from his duties. He couldn't just walk away as one of the leaders. Royal Geographical Society, as we talked about, they did go ahead and endorse the expedition. India, they needed a suitable base of operations for the landing facility. So they worked with India and came up with Labalu Landing Field, which is about 10 miles north of Purnia in the Bihar state. Nepal. At this time, Westerners were not allowed into Nepal without special permission. This included aircraft. However, we talked about the 1932 flight. Cracked that door open when the Maharaja's son wanted to go for a flight, and he said, no, you're the next in line, you can't go up in one of these silly planes. So he gave Halliburton and Stevens the approval to fly into Nepal to Mount Everest in their little Jenny Curtis. And so they'd already cracked that door of letting the aircraft into Nepal. So it wasn't that big of a next step for it. So the Maharaja did agree to one flight and a second one only if required. He was to be informed prior to the flight, which they couldn't do. They could only inform him once the flight's taken off. No practice flights over Nepal were approved. You could not practice flying over Nepal. There were no unnecessary photos to be taken. The towns were not supposed to be photographed, anything like that. It was strictly for mapping up in the Mount Everest region. And then they also had to go reach out to the Dalai Lama in Tibet and say, hey, don't worry, we're not going to fly over Tibet. If you're going to fly over the top of Everest, half your plane's going to be in Tibet. So they were going to fly a little bit over Tibet, but for the sake of the Dalai Lama, don't worry about it, we're not going to do it. They approached Lady Hston, and to be clear, her name is pronounced Hston in English, not like the town in Texas with the American pronunciation. So it is Lady Hston. She was a big patron of aviation technology. Now we have to remember, back then in England, the British government didn't sponsor these expeditions. They had to raise funds to get these expeditions off the ground. Lady Hston came up with and committed £10,000, which was quite a bit at that point in time, and another $5,000 if needed. So they went ahead and named the expedition after her, the Hston Mt Everest expedition. Now, even those amount of funds were not enough to actually fund this expedition. So they actually gave exclusive rights to the Times newspaper and to the Gaumont British Picture Corporation to film a movie of the expedition. So this would bring in a lot more money. So the expedition begins. First thing is, got to pack up the 2 aircraft and ship them to India. So on February 9th, they're packed up and put into the cargo hold of the merchant vessel Dalgoma. The postcard image there on the left is of the Dalgoma, and there on the right you can see they're loading one of the aircraft into the cargo hold of the Dalgoma to be shipped over to India. In addition to shipping the 2 primary aircraft, they're going to take 3 other aircraft, and they're going to fly them from Hston, England, all the way. So on February 16th, they go ahead and meet out at the Hston airfield. The stamp on the right shows the media photos, a lot of media there. It's a big deal for the 3 aircraft. And the aircraft you can see there is a Fox Moth. First aircraft, they're going to use a Puss Moth, and Air Commodore Fellows and his wife will be flying in this all the way to India. It's a high-wing aircraft. They'll be using this for survey flights while they're in India, where they go up and check the height of the clouds and a lot of the things like that. The Fox Moth, this is the larger of the 3 aircraft. They'll be using that to haul equipment from Karachi up to Pune and back and forth, and using it for moving a lot of equipment. In this one, will be Clydesdale will be the pilot, and then Shepard and Hughes will also be riding along. And then the Gypsy Moth, McIntyre will be flying this. This is the slowest aircraft of the group. It can fly about 60 miles an hour, so they're all going to have to fly a little slower for it, because some of these other aircraft can actually fly 80 miles an hour. So the flight eastward begins, and just to be clear, they took off on February 16th, and what they said in their books later was, "We often told each other in reminiscent discussions that we were in more danger before we reached India than we were when we were over the Himalaya." So they take off from Hston on the 16th, February 16th. They go down to Naples. Well, in Naples, they fly over Vesuvius. But just before they land in Naples, they wanted to get some pictures. Well, they land and they're detained. Europe is very on edge still at this time between the wars. And Italy is very much on edge and has a lot of restrictions. Not allowed to photograph anything over Italy. So they're detained, their cameras and film are taken. Luckily, they just take the film out of the cameras and give the cameras back to the crews. So film's gone. They get up, take off. Screw it, we're going to go down to Catania. Well, they get down to Catania. Now they're actually arrested. Evidently, they flew too close to restricted airspace. They say they avoided it. The Italians say, you went over it. So they're arrested and they're interrogated for a few hours. They're released finally, and they're sitting there. So the weather's been pretty bad there anyway. So they're sitting there for a few days. They keep trying to fly from Catania down to Tripoli, but the weather's really bad. Another part of the problem is every time they take off and come back, they're charged more landing fees. One time they're only gone for 20 minutes before they all 3 turn around and come back. Say, no, can't do it. Landing fees. So they finally decide we're not going to be able to make it from Catania down to Tripoli. Let's go over to Trapani out there on the island. Well, that's restricted airspace. So they finally have to get all governments involved, reach out to Rome. Can we please fly to Trapani and land there and then go from there? They get the approval. So they fly to Trapani. When they get there, the winds are so high, they actually wind up, the passengers have to jump out of the planes and hold the wings because it's just too windy. So they go through a lot along this trip. It's an amazing trip along northern Africa. They deal with dust storms, mud, rain, good times, bad times, everything. But finally, on March 5th, they reach Karachi, where they can start helping to put the airplanes together. Going to go ahead and get a lot of the guys from the base there, the British guys, to go up to Pune with them so that they can help support the group. So they go on, and finally they're at their destination, Pranay, on the 22nd. So life in Pranay while they're there. There's a picture of all the guys. There's about 20 of the Brits. There's a lot of Indians were helping out with this also. They're not in the picture. But there are about 22 of them that were there. Senior members would stay in the Darbanga, the Raj Darbanga. He let them use his bungalow there, which is about 6 rooms with a veranda all the way around. The senior people stayed there, and they had another room they could use as a dark room and some storage and stuff like that. So they all stayed at the bungalow. Now, the junior members were in tents out at the airfield. But you got to remember, these guys are engineers. They got generators to help with all the work with the aircraft and everything. So they wind up fixing up their tents. So they have lamps, they have lights at night, they have phonographs they can play, they have everything. Whereas at the bungalow, they got no electricity, or they're still by candlelight there. So the guys out at the base, out at the airfield, did pretty darn good. They also were going to be helping the postal and the telegraph with support, because Pranay did not usually get that much mail and stuff going back and forth. So they actually had staff members help the Pranay post office with their work. Some of the experiences they had while they were staying there: vipers in the fields. So they had to walk quite a ways to go to the dinner hall, places where they had dinners, and they were invited to fancy dinners, but coming home at night to the bungalows and everywhere, they had to be careful for vipers. They never got bit, but there were vipers in the fields they had to have help with chasing them away. Crocodiles in the swimming pond. They had a swim tank not far from the bungalow, but all the local animals were using it and everything. It was pretty gross. So they's like, no, well, there's this pond over by the airfield. Let's go ahead and get in that thing. So they hired some of the locals to clean out the weeds and stuff, so they go swimming. They go swimming every day, and there's this one log that kind of moves around out there. Well, they do a little closer inspection. Well, they're swimming with a crocodile. So they wind up putting some spotters up on this little, you can see one of the expedition members up on their little platform up there, would sit up there and be a spotter on the crocodile, tell them if he was coming their way or not. They weren't going to give up their swimming just for a crocodile. Just as long as that crocodile stayed there, they would be over here. So they had a good time with that. They finally got some sharp shooters. They hired some of the locals to sit on the bank with rifles to try to shoot it. Took a long time. They believe they finally got a shot at one point, but then another one found its way there. It looked a little bit different. So another crocodile. They got by. They had an elephant chase. One day they're at the bungalow. All the senior members are at the bungalow, and they're having fun. There's an elephant with its baby elephant there. They'd give the elephant a push, and the elephant pushes them back. They push. They have fun. One of the senior leaders, and I can't remember which leader it was, got up and said, "This is stupid, guys. Quit messing around." Goes off and smacks the elephant to get rid of it. Well, this kind of pissed off the elephant. Little baby elephant starts chasing him. So they're having a race around the bungalow, and everybody else sitting up on the veranda taking bets as to who's going to win. They figure, okay, I can't remember which guy it was that was getting chased, but they figure he's doing about 15 miles an hour. That elephant's doing about 14.9. But their guy is probably going to get tired before the elephant does. So really, who's going to win this race? So it goes around quite a bit. They said it was stirring up a cloud of smoke. You just see this cloud of smoke going around the building. And some more people came in from around to watch what was going on. They said it was just a hoot and holler. Until the guy decided, okay, well, there's a hallway that goes through the bungalow. It splits the two halves of the bungalow. He's going to go through that. So he makes a hard turn to go through the bungalow, and the elephant makes a hard turn to go through the bungalow. Luckily, the elephant decides, nah, because everybody else on the veranda is starting to scatter. They don't know where the elephant's going to go, and they don't want to be a part of the chase. That ended. That did go good. They also got to fly the mail while they were there. The aircraft they were using to fly the mail from Pune down to Delhi crashed. So they helped flying the mail. And the movie film, they're all getting to be part of that. A lot of them hated it. They didn't want to be part of it. These are pilots. I'm not no damned actor. But you want the funding from the movie, you will act in the movie. And they're doing a lot of flights for it too. So the first flight over Everest on April 3rd. So the weather reports were not within limits. The limits they believed for the flight were 40 miles per hour coming from the west. They're coming from the south. So if the winds are 40 miles from the west, that's pushing them to the right of the peak. Not within limits. They'd have to really crab more into the wind than they had expected to. Also, the tops of the clouds were higher than they wanted. But they decide, no, we got to go. We got to do this. They're realizing with all their weather reports and stuff, that wind's never going to calm down. In the Westland Wallace, the PV-6, Clydesdale's the pilot and Blacker's the observer. In the Westland PV3, McIntyre is going to be the pilot and Bonnet's going to be the observer. So they take off. And the first thing they have is, well, they're trying to get through the cloud banks, get up above the clouds. By the time they do, they can't spot the towns they're wanting to spot because everything's by ground. You don't have any navigation beacons. So they're trying to watch the towns on the ground. They're already a little bit to the right. The wind's pushing them a little further to the right than they expected. On the way up, well, Clydesdale's oxygen fails. He's trying to reach back and try to get a screwdriver from Blacker. Blacker finally gets him a screwdriver so he can work with stuff and get hooked up to the emergency oxygen so he can continue. Now, the problem is they also start to approach Everest and the Everest Massif, which is Mount Everest and Mount Lhotse. Lhotse is the fourth highest in the world. So these are big peaks up here, just a massive of them. And so they're approaching them. They're approaching from the right now. Well, they were hoping to approach from the left where the winds are coming out of the west. That's going to push you up. So you're going to catch updrafts. Well, now they're on the downwind side, on the downdraft. So they get slammed by downdrafts. They actually almost hit the peaks. One of the aircraft, I can't remember which one, actually clears the saddle there that they're trying to get over by about 15 feet. Now, you got to understand, the observer's in the back looking through a square piece of glass straight at the ground. All he's doing is seeing ground come up. It's coming up. It's coming up. He has no idea if they're going to clear it or not. He has no way of looking forward. I'm sure he probably peed himself a little, but they did get over it. So they wound up having to circle over in Tibet and around those areas. So they do get up there, and they do get over the peak. They'll both fly over the peak. So it's the first time the peak is flown over. Also, Bonnet's O2 line completely breaks now. So Bonnet, the observer in the Westland PV3 with McIntyre, no oxygen. And all McIntyre can do is look back, and Bonnet's just laying on the ground. He doesn't know if he's dead or just unconscious or what, but can't do anything about it. So, yes, it's a success. They did clear the summit by about 500 feet, like we talked about. That's an image of the summit from the aircraft looking down on Mount Everest. Clydesdale went over first, and McIntyre went over it second. There's a little bit of failure. The photographic equipment did fail, they found out. So they did not get the photographs they wanted. So the scientific goal was not achieved. The top right image, that's looking at Mount Everest in the center there from the aircraft. And that would be the PV6, because the PV6 actually has that cowling around the engine. And over on the far right is Makalu. And that's the fifth highest peak in the world. The stamp on the lower right was a stamp put out by the Commonwealth of Dominica. Now it's to celebrate aviation through the years. Little picture of Orville and Wilbur, but the big picture is actually of the Everest flight. And that would be the PV6 in front photo. That is actually a reproduction of the photo that was taken from the PV3 as they approach Mount Everest. First flight over Everest. They did go up. They stayed a little further off than they wanted to. They circled the peak and then they come back down. So everything does work pretty darned good. The stamp on the left there that's Douglas Clydesdale. He's got a lot of names. And he was, like I said, he was flying the one aircraft, and then McIntyre on the stamp on the right. He was on the second aircraft that went over. So the mail. Now, if you look at the picture on the right, you see that Colonel Etherton is handing up a bag of letters to Clydesdale. If you zoom in, like I got that little window zoomed in, it actually says Everest Mail on that bag. So that's going into the PV6. On return, the envelopes were signed and certified as being carried over Mount Everest by either one of the pilots or the observers. So they're all signed. And that there's my cover. And it's actually canceled on the 3rd. Supposedly 25 were handed up. And of course, the dignitaries, the king gets one, royal family gets one, Lady Hston gets one. So there weren't a lot went out into the collector's community. So these are very rare and scarce. They're hard to get a hold of. This one I actually got on eBay for a very good price. Most likely, it was just blank envelopes. Now, all the envelopes are from the bungalow. They have the name on the back of them. So probably just grabbed a stack of envelopes and handed them up, because each one had to be weighed later for the stamp on it and used, then cancel the stamp. Some went airmail, some didn't, so they're all different. So most likely, it was just empty envelopes. Well, since the photographic equipment failed, they decided the next day we're going to go up over Mount Kangchenjanga, which is the 3rd highest peak in the world. Not far from where they are. But it's also on the Nepal-India border. So they can go over it and say they're staying in India, kind of like they said they didn't go over Tibet. So part of the plane might go over, but they're good. So that in the Westland Wallace, Ellison's the pilot, Bonnet this time is the observer. On the PV3, Fellows will be the pilot, and Fisher will be the observer. They check out the camera equipment, but get to run it, and it turns out a success. They're able to get the camera equipment to work now. However, on the return, again, Fellows, the pilot, he's on the PV3, oxygen line fails again. So he's a little confused, dazed and confused, isn't getting going the right direction right away. So he's using up fuel and realizes we don't have enough fuel. We need to land. So he lands on a field in India, and all these people come out. He said about 10,000 people from the village. They've never seen a plane. Everybody's trying to touch the plane. He still has his engine running. And all of a sudden dawns on him, I don't have the crank. Because these require a crank to start these engines. And if I shut this engine off, we're not starting. So he's able to scare enough of the people back away so he can take back off, gets back in the air, and it dawns on him again, we still don't have enough fuel. It's still not going to work. So he has to make a second landing, and this time, yes, they do shut the engine off. Needless to say, they know how much fuel is, and when they're sitting back at Labubu airfield, 15, 20 minutes go by, and the other aircraft's not coming. It's not coming. So they jump in the Puss Moth and take off. It's their scouting plane for that. And they find them and land. Everything's good. Everything's okay. There was no crash. It was just a forced landing. Well, that little aircraft can't carry fuel and didn't carry the crank either. So at least they find them. They fly back. Okay, the next day they fly one of the bigger aircraft over with a lot of fuel and the crank, and they're able to take off and get back. None of the documentation talks about covers, but there are 3 covers documented as having been flown over Kangchenjanga. These are certified, again, by the pilots or the observers. And now this cover is not in my collection. This is in Anthony Bard's collection. But there are 3 covers that are documented. So we're setting a precedent that, the books that are out there and all the documentation, they don't say that they put any envelopes on this flight, but there obviously were. As for incoming mail, I don't know if any of you have collected for expedition mail or anything like that. Incoming mail is extremely scarce and rare. Somebody receives a letter, they generally burn the envelope, use it for fodder for the fire to keep them warm, or they just don't carry a lot of extra stuff around with them. But there are 3 covers. 2 years ago, there was only 1 identified. Now there's 2, and I do have this one's in my collection. They were mailed to the leading aircraft man Hensley. He was in charge of the fabric, the fittings, and rigging of the aircraft. So he was out there at Labubu. Originally to Hensley, he was stationed in Karachi. So correctly, it was sent originally to him there. It was received on April 5th. Well, somebody put down the wrong town name. They put down Pania. Wrong part of India. That's actually going away from them. That arrived there on 7th, and then it was forwarded because then in Pania, everybody knows where this Everest expedition is. Most people do. Now let's correct it to Pernay. And went on to Pernay, so he did receive it. But that is a fun item. Also as part of this, Stephen Smith, he was a very famous philatelist in India. He was the father of rocket mail in India. They actually put out a commemorative stamp for him in India because of all he did for first flights, aviation, all this stuff. And just like the 1932 flying carpet flight, he fingers into that one. He immediately hears about this successful. I want to bring some envelopes and have them fly him over Everest too. So he comes up there on the 7th and hands 87 covers from members of the Airmail Society. Hands them to them, and they say, well, come back tomorrow. We'll give you your covers back. And by the way, you have to give us 1 guinea each for each cover to raise funds for the RAF charities. So hands them to him, comes back the next day, gets all 87 back, has them canceled in Purnea there. Mailing, they all went back to the India Airmail Society in Calcutta. To be clear, these did not go over Nepal, much less Mt Everest. They did not have approval. They could not have a joyride over Nepal. That was strictly forbidden. And this would have destroyed the expedition. So no, they did not go. They just were on a survey flight over India as part of the expedition. I know a lot of people out there like to claim these went over Everest. They did not. They went up in one of their little survey aircraft just around the local area. So the second flight over Everest. This was prepared in secret because they had already been told by leaders of the expedition, no more flights over Everest. We're done. It's over. Lady Hston also sends them a letter. No more flights over Everest. The insurance companies had canceled their insurance now. And these are expensive aircraft, and much less the guys, too. They could die. This was pretty dangerous to fly over these peaks. They do this. They start planning this in secret. Keep everybody out of it. Because if the word gets out, they'll get busted. Their leader, Fellows, has actually been sick for a few weeks, and he's in bed, under bed rest. And Ellison, who was a part of the first flight, he's still active military. If he goes against the commander's direction, he's going to get court-martialed. So that anybody with the military, they had to keep out of it, everything. So this was actually done in secret. But they're working with the weather guy that's sending up balloons and checking things. And winds are really not good this day. They are 80 miles an hour up there. That's the speed of your aircraft. It was not good, but they decided we didn't finish the job. And these are all professional guys. Our job was to do the mapping. Everything failed. We didn't finish. Don't care about flying over the peak. We didn't finish the mapping. What they decided to do, they're going to fly westbound for quite a ways through India. And then they're going to fly straight north, because flying straight north, the winds are just going to push them back over Mount Everest. So they tell the mechanics, not telling them what for, put all the remaining oxygen available on these aircraft, because they don't have enough even for this flight. Fuel them all the way up, everything you can. We're just going for a flight. Don't worry about it. They take off and they go westbound, then they start heading north. They do not turn on their oxygen until they have to, because they don't have enough oxygen to really do much of a flight. So in the Westland Wallace, the PV-6, McIntyre's the pilot and Fisher's the observer. And they actually wind up going over Mount Everest. And then in the PV-3, Clydesdale and Blacker, they don't quite get the elevation, but they don't have the oxygen to sit there and circle to try to get over, or the fuel. So Clydesdale and Blacker actually cut off to the right, and they just go on back. So one aircraft did go over Everest, the other one did not. So technically, you've got 3 successful flights over the summit. Newspaper report, a fine bit of insubordination. That was the headline of the newspapers, because it was insubordination. They went against all the direction of all the heads, but they did it. And so it was successful. Everything was forgiven. Nobody crashed. Everything went very well. So there are additional covers, a lot of other covers out there too. And a lot of people are saying that, well, if it has the expedition cancel, which is that upper right one, it flew over on one of the Everest flights. We do not know that for sure. That cancellation is actually the first time any expedition to the Himalaya has used a canceling device with the expedition name on it. Generally, it's the local cancel and they put a cache. They had this cache that's down below it too. Did these other covers go over? We don't know. There was actually one cover I read the contents from where the person sending it to his niece up in England said, I was able to get one of the envelopes with the cache. I know you're going to love this. Have fun. Not a word about flying over Everest. I mean, I was seriously, you would send something to somebody and I say, no, this went over Everest? No, it's just, he says he got the expedition cache. Maybe they started to just use the canceling device on request after the success. Now that they have had one success, who knows? The cache, there is one cover out there that used the cache to cancel the stamps. That one's in my collection also. That's the only one known where they used the cache to cancel the stamps. That cache is the lower right marking there that says Hston, Mt Everest flight 1933. That's a cache. That was supposed to be just a cache, not a cancellation device. So the final results. Mapping, a complete success. Now that image on the right is one of the 3D images taken by them. So they were able to do regional detailed mapping, do the 3D mapping. Mapping was a success. They got it done. Cameras, not very successful. They were too complex to be used in the flight. Plus, they were very fragile. Towards the end, you weren't allowed to touch the box that the camera was even in unless you were one of the observers, because just jiggling it a little bit caused problems, caused the failures. These guys, when they'd be riding in the vehicles out to the airfield, the observers were carrying the box with the cameras, equipment, just to try to buffer the jolting. So these cameras, long-term, didn't turn out very good. Oxygen system, I think we can clearly say that oxygen system was a failure. Heated suits, they kept them warm, but they also wound up with burns. Something like the observers were on their knees and having to kneel over everything while they're pushing against the electrical. They actually wound up with burns on their shins at times, just because of the electrical lines going through it. They weren't perfect. Aircraft engines, they were successful. They did very good at altitude. They performed as required and maintained performance. They had no engine problems the whole time. Lessons learned. They learned a lot, and that was a big part of their success. This was to learn a lot of technological information. They were very successful. They gathered a lot of information about high-altitude aircraft systems. The flight over the highest point of the Earth, yeah, they were successful. They did it with 3 different times. 2 aircraft on the first flight and 1 aircraft on the second flight. They did fly over that. They flew over Kangchenjanga, the 3rd highest. They flew over Lhotse, the 4th highest. They flew over Makalu, the 5th highest. It was a pretty successful flight for that. And this was also important to the Brits too, because early on they did discuss, they didn't like to admit it, but the Brits had been being left behind. They were one of the great empires of the world. Everybody else was having these flight firsts. First flight over the oceans was not done by the Brits. The Americans were doing all these successes, and everybody else flying over the poles. The Brits were being left behind on being world leaders. So yes, they did put a feather in their cap and say, yep, we got that one. You also got to remember the upcoming war. They're not that far away from the upcoming war, and a lot of knowledge was taken out of this to actually understand high altitude flying and what's required to have functional pilots, functional aircraft, and things like that at these higher altitudes. And yes, the movie. Don't forget the movie. It was a documentary film. The whole thing was filmed during the expedition. Pilots were suckered into that. They bitch a lot about that, but they did the flight. They did the movie. They actually put cameras on the aircraft to film a lot of things. They wanted to put a movie camera under the wing going over Everest, but that was going to cause problems. Directed by Jeffrey Barkas and Ivor Montague. And believe it or not, it won the Academy Award in 1936 for Best Subject. This is available on YouTube. You can go out and watch the movie. It's black and white, but it is the movie of the expedition, and it's out there on YouTube. You can go check it out. So recommended reading. As a pilot and all that, I do like to read about these flights. The first book, First Over Everest, the Hston Mt Everest Expedition, pretty good book. It gives really good knowledge, but they really focus a lot on the politics and Lady Hston. The pilots were not asked to help write that book. They did not provide any input to that book. So they came up with their own. Clydesdale and McIntyre came up with their own book. As a pilot, I love the book because they actually talk about the flight from Hston Airfield in England to India a lot, about all the things they went through along that flight in North Africa. They talk a lot more about swimming with the crocodiles and a lot more about the insubordination. Really good book. A lot more, not as many photos in that one, but a lot harder to get a hold of that book, but it's a good book to read, especially if you like aviation. Later on, the son of Douglas Clydesdale Hamilton, his son, James Douglas Hamilton, wrote a book, and it's another one. It's a pretty good book, a little more modern, more of the photos, better photos, things like that. Now, the London Philatelist last year put out a 2-part article that was written by Pradip Jain and Anthony Bard. They wrote a good article about this also. That's also a good reference you can always go read. And then, of course, the movie Wings Over Everest. Thanks for listening to